Paul Tillich is probably one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century, even if his name is not as well known as some of the other greats of the 20th century. And partly I think the reason for that is that Tillich's view is very much that theology has to be done in dialogue with the contemporary moment. And of course, once one adopts that sort of approach, then it's inevitable, perhaps, that one is slightly therefore left behind. In fact, one of Tillich's commentators has talked about a planned obsolescence to Tillich's works, which I think is perhaps a slightly unfair way of putting it, but gets the point that Tillich's idea, central to Tillich's thinking really, is that theology must engage with the contemporary. Tillich was born in 1886 in a village called Starsedel, which was at that point in Germany, in Prussia. It's now in Poland, just over the border, and it's very much in that kind of border country. And after I think about 15, Tillich moved to another town, again in East Prussia, in that area. And these are places which have historically shifted between German and Polish. And that figure of the boundary is something that is quite important in understanding Tillich. It's the title he chose for his own autobiography, On the Boundary. So Tillich, as I say, was born 1886 in East Prussia. His father is a Lutheran minister who becomes what is known as a superintendent, which is essentially a kind of equivalent to a bishop figure, and then eventually moves to Berlin and becomes a reasonably prominent figure in Prussian Lutheran Church. He, for example, accompanies the Kaiser on a trip to Jerusalem. Tillich's father is standardly represented as being a somewhat austere, old-school, 19th century patrician church figure. I mean, his interest is very much in the kind of more conservative figures of the 19th century. I think that's quite important in that Tillich is very much somebody who is stands against those kind of conservative tendencies. Initially those of his father, and then subsequently those of the more kind of established academic theology. It's pretty clear from very early on that Tillich is a bright child and is destined to follow his father into the Lutheran Church. He studies initially in Berlin, then spends some time in Tübingen, and then Halle. That's reasonably standard for theologians of that time. In fact, it still is in Germany today, that studies will be undertaken in various different universities. He is especially influenced in Halle by someone called Martin Kähler, not very well known today, but quite an important figure in his time. And Kähler was very important in the sense that he addressed the question of the historical Jesus. In the late 19th century, the question of the historicity of Jesus was essentially one of the big questions. The idea of the quest for the historical Jesus and all of that. And Kähler really says, well, a lot of that's really irrelevant. The point is not whether a certain man, Jesus, existed and did certain things. The important thing is the impact that figure had. So in this contrast between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith, Kähler emphasizes the historical impact of the Christ of faith. And that's something that Tillich very much adopts and is very influenced by. So after in the midst of his theological studies, Tillich became increasingly interested in philosophy. He'd read Hegel, of course, he'd read Hegel, yes, but he'd read Kant, more importantly, as a younger student. But it really, as his theological studies drew to an end, he became more and more interested in a particular figure, that is the German idealist Schelling. The way Tillich tells the story, he came across the complete works of Schelling on special offer, second hand in a bookshop somewhere in the back streets of Berlin, and then bought them, took them home, and was enthralled. Now we have to be slightly suspicious about that in the sense that Nietzsche tells a similar story about his discovery of Schopenhauer. There's a certain sort of sense there that Tillich is already perhaps mythologizing his education there. But nonetheless, Schelling becomes absolutely crucial for Tillich. Schelling is a neglected figure in the history of German philosophy. He's often thought of as a kind of moment somehow between Hegel and Marx and Feuerbach and the more radical young Hegelians. But Schelling is an important figure in his own right. And one of the central things about Schelling's thought is that he's constantly trying, in different ways throughout his career, he's constantly trying to synthesize what we might think of as the dialectic between the ideal and the real. Yeah, so between thought and being. Yeah, this idea that philosophy is primarily concerned with forming ideas, and yet these ideas must somehow be brought into interaction, into dialogue with reality as it is encountered. Yeah. Schelling develops various kind of iterations of this. At one point he develops a philosophy of nature, a philosophy of art, and then finally in his later writings a philosophy of revelation, in which the real is represented really by the sort of, to use Schelling's word, the unprethinkable arrival of revelation as something that is real, that can't somehow be incorporated into the ideal framework. That dialectic between the real and the ideal is crucial for Tillich. So Tillich, say, becomes deeply, deeply influenced by Schelling, and he writes his PhD dissertation on Schelling, and then subsequently writes a philosophical dissertation on Schelling. And this is quite unusual. Normally, of course, people are encouraged to write on different topics, but Tillich writes primarily, say, on Schelling in this period. And it, as I say, absorbs this Schelling's thought and this central question into his own thought. Another way of putting this, which I think is important for subsequent development of Tillich's own thought, is that Schelling is concerned with what he calls the unconditioned, the unbedingt. The German word there, unbedingt, ding is thing. Yeah, so it's sort of the unthinged, or the unthingly. It's always a risk to try and translate German words, especially proper theological and philosophical German words. But anyway, so the unbedingt, the unconditioned, yeah? And for Schelling, the unconditioned is something that obviously must come before, beneath, beyond, above the conditioned, yeah? And yet is somehow to be encountered through the conditioned. Yeah. So we have this dynamic of this inbreaking of the real into the ideal, of reality, being into thought, and also of that which transcends the conditioned realities, somehow making itself manifest within the conditioned realities, and yet always through those conditioned realities. Yeah. So the final kind of point here is, in Tillich's own development, is that he rejects explicitly any notion of what he calls supernaturalism. Yeah. So the idea that one could somehow step outside of the conditioned realm of reality, of culture, of history, of religion, to come into some kind of direct contact with that which transcends it with God, is just implausible for Tillich. Yeah? So theological thinking must take place within the constraints, as it were, of the conditioned, but always on the understanding that the conditioned is itself somehow transcended, somehow broken through by the unconditioned. Yeah. So Tillich's theological and philosophical studies were completed really in 1912, and he was then ordained into the Lutheran Church and took up a position in Berlin. Interestingly, he was sent to an area called Moabit, which is now apparently quite a trendy area, as so many areas in Berlin are apparently, but at that point was very much a working class area. And Tillich, of course, the pastor's son, from having studied theology and philosophy, very much concerned with abstract ideas, the unconditioned, the absolute, all these sort of things. Yeah, then came into contact with working class Berliners, and that had a profound effect upon him. And he's said in his subsequent autobiographies that he was just not aware of the conditions of the working class in that time, and that influenced his own thinking, particularly the development of what he came to describe as religious socialism, and that's something which will be important in a later stage in Tillich's development. For the moment, we can just sort of note that he's struck by that, and by the need again there to bring Christian theology into dialogue with the situation of the people who are receiving it. That the theologian must not just simply